Hello everyone, and welcome back to another remote sensing lecture video. And in this lecture video, I want to continue our discussion on image interpretation by talking about this idea of size. So when we talked about shape, we said that shape was sort of the outline of an object, whether it was rectangular, circular, diamond, maybe it was the pentagon to be a very specific example. And we said that we could say, was it long and skinny? Was it short and wide? Right, now we're talking about size, which is the size of the object. Now it's important to know that there are two different distinctions here. In photogrammetry, which is a subset of remote sensing, right, we are able to get actual measurements. So size could be the actual size, right, measured in the image. Right, and you can imagine this would be really useful for something like a football field or a baseball diamond or anything where they have a pretty standard size and you can actually measure it and say, yeah, this is 100 yards long, for example. Right? Or it could also be relative size. Right, so this is compared to known standard references. Right, so for example, and this is actually one of the examples we're going to go through in a second here, right? Everybody knows more or less what the size of a normal car is. So if you can look at something and say, oh, there's a car in the image over here. Is it bigger than the car? Is it smaller than the car? Is it roughly the same size as the car? Right? That's the idea of relative size. And you can imagine how useful that might be for, say, again, the example we're going to go through is the idea of roads, right? Is it 3 cars? Is it 2 cars? Is it 1 car? Right? That relative size is going to be really important. Again, you could actually measure it and say, oh, well, this is, 14 feet versus 7 feet, but you may not necessarily be able to do that for a variety of reasons. But having this relative size is extremely useful as well. So let's go ahead and look at a couple of examples of size here. So this is the first one that I want to look at. I'm going to slide over just a little bit. And what I want to do is So let's look at this example. I want to slide over just a little bit. And what I want to do is I want to look at I want to compare the 3 different roads here. So the first one is going to be in this image, right? I want to look at this road right here. And again, I'm just cutting out a section of it. I'm not cutting out the whole thing, right? Versus this road right here. Versus this road right here. Right? And if you remember when we talked about roads versus parking lots, when we talked about shape, right, we said that roads tend to be long and relatively skinny. But we can take that a step further by incorporating this idea of size, and in particular, this idea of relative size, right? So looking at this road right here, right, we can say this is basically 2 cars wide, maybe 3, right? So you would feel pretty confident that saying that this is some sort of like a neighborhood side street, right? This would be something you would see in your average neighborhood, right? You might assume, and again, we'll talk about context later, but you might assume that these are houses, right? And this is just a neighborhood side street. Right? This is something you would see, driving through a neighborhood. In contrast, right, we see that this has, multiple cars going in one direction, multiple cars going in another direction. So this is, 4 cars wide, maybe 5 cars wide. So you might assume that this would be, a pretty major street. Because it's wider, right? It's wider. Its size is wider. And then finally, I want to slide over a little bit more here. Let's look at this example right here. Right here, we see that there are multiple cars going in each direction, right? More than this case. So we might assume here that this might be an example of a freeway or an expressway or a very, very, very major street, right? Most likely this is an expressway. So again, right, even within this idea of a long, narrow object that we would consider to be a road, right, we can get more granular and we can say, okay, well, how wide is the road, especially relative to the cars that we can see? And we can use that to say, okay, well, this is a neighborhood side street, this is maybe a major road, and maybe this is a freeway or an expressway. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Let's go ahead and scroll down here, and I want to talk about another example. And again, we're going to talk about context in a different video here, because context would definitely help with this one. But what I want to do is I want to just focus on one building. I want to focus on this building here and this building here. And I want to focus on them relative to this car right here and this car right here. All right, so you might look at this and say, okay, well, this is much larger relative to this car, as opposed to this one is relatively smaller compared to this car. So you may feel confident in saying that this might be an apartment and this might be a normal house. Right, and again, we'll talk about context, which would definitely make this case even stronger, right? But the idea here is that relative to this car, right, this is relatively smaller compared to this car. This is relatively larger. So you might make the case this is an apartment, or maybe it's a store, right? This is definitely going to be something where you would have a much larger building footprint relative to a car, as opposed to this, which is a much smaller building footprint relative to a car. So this might be a house. And just to sort of wrap this up, I want to look at this. So these are at this. So just to wrap this up, I want to just sort of compare the two side by side so you can get a real feel for the relative size. Right. So this is this building here. Right. This building is this building here, and this building is this building here. Right, and so you can see here just the magnitude of size difference when they're right next to each other like that. And again, these are at the same scale. So we didn't zoom in on one or zoom out on the other. And you can see this is much smaller than this, which is another indication that this would likely be a house and this would likely be either a shopping area or an apartment building. Right, so again, size, especially relative size, can play a really important role in interpretation. So hopefully this makes sense. And as always, please reach out. Thank you.